Flathub has grown from this fairly niche platform from obtaining this fairly niche packaging solution called a Flatpak to now having over 2,400 apps available. And the early goal of the platform was just get applications available and preferably have them by the first-party developer, but even if it's a third-party, just get them on Flathub. But now that we're here, now that we have all of these apps available, and it's not everything, and not everything is by the developer of the project, but now that we're here, maybe it's time to have some additional guidelines, some additional goals to make the platform overall better, raising the bar, introducing the new app metadata guidelines. While there are a lot of beautiful modern apps, there are also a lot of apps with low quality metadata, ugly icons, or out-of-date screenshots. This means that looking at the new and updated list on the Flathub homepage, you get the impression that most of the apps on Flathub are low quality. One of the biggest reasons for the prevalence of low quality app metadata is probably that historically, people were not discovering apps from their repositories very often. Instead, they were installing the same few classics with well-known brands, VLC, Blender, Chromium, Firefox, so on and so forth, all relying on word of mouth for discovery. Now that new apps are being released on a weekly basis, app metadata becomes much more important for introducing people to these new apps. I typically still use it in this classic approach where I go to Flathub for a very specific reason. I want OBS, I want VLC, or anything I know that is specifically there. But with how many apps are available now, you can just browse it like an application store that you would use on something like Android or iOS or any of these other platforms. The way we fix this is with a two-pronged approach. Firstly, raising the bar for metadata for all apps, introducing guidelines for how an app should look, what an app should include, and generally trying to make it better. And secondly, for those apps that actually do meet the criteria, highlight those apps with curation of the store. This does not mean that apps that do not meet the criteria are not going to be allowed on the store. They're going to be allowed, it's just they are not going to be promoted as much as some of the others. And as a developer, you'll be informed of all of the criteria and what specifically you need to work on, and hopefully, specifically what is wrong about what you are doing right now. This right here is the documentation. We're going to go over probably all of it. Now, most of it I feel is fairly self-explanatory, fairly just uncontroversial. Some of it, though, I can understand developers being put in a position where they simply cannot do anything about it. But let's get to that. Firstly, no trademark violations. This includes the name, icon, and summary. For example, if your app is a Telegram client or a web wrapper, it should not be called Telegram for Linux or use the official Telegram icon. Instead, it should have its own identity, e.g. paper plane with a custom icon. If it's made clear that it's a third-party client, it can be okay to mention the original service, e.g. tally for plausible, but in most cases, it should be avoided. Say, for example, you have a Mastodon client, for example, you might say X name for Mastodon. That makes sense. Now, a really good example of not doing this is this app right here, WhatsApp Desktop, which uses the WhatsApp icon called WhatsApp Desktop. Don't do this, basically. Managed by the app author. It is preferred that the Flatpak is made by the developer of the project. Now, a lot of Flatpaks are by third-party developers, but if you are doing that, it is recommended that you go and approach the project and in some form try to make what you're doing an official part of their project, like what happened in the OBS Flatpak. Now, icons are where things get a bit tougher. Firstly, icon size. The icon should be an SVG or PNG with a size greater or equal to 256 by 256 pixels. Totally fair. No one should complain about that. Reasonable footprint. The icon shouldn't fill too much or too little of the canvas. So you are given an example of how big your icon should be. And it shouldn't be touching the absolute edges of the canvas, but it also shouldn't be this tiny thing in the middle. It should use a reasonable amount of space, and there is a template here that you can work with. This is also a fairly reasonable request, as it doesn't require actually modifying the image, it's just resizing the image that already exists. Next, we have good contrast. There are a lot of icons out there that take no consideration to the fact that dark themes exist or light themes exist. They just design them around the very specific case that they are going to be using them in, and that's it. So don't have dark lines around the edges of your icon. Don't have really bright lines around the edges, because it is going to blend in with either a light theme or a dark theme. If you're the first-party packager of an application, go and fix your icon. But if you're a third-party, this is a problem that is simply not solvable without making a custom icon. And if you're making a custom icon, then it's kind of unclear if you're trying to package the main application or if it's supposed to be a fork or what it is. So this is a bit of a difficult one to deal with. The next couple, though, are a bit more of a problem. Not too much or too little detail. I don't fully agree with these examples. I think this icon here is totally reasonable. This, you could probably argue, is too simple just because it's 2 arrows, it's very generic. You probably shouldn't use text in an icon. That I will agree with. But this icon here, this is a well-made icon going by the standards of 10, 15 years ago. The only issue with it is it's not aligned with modern design principles, but it's very likely that this is an icon the project's been using for the past 10, 15 years. No baked-in shadows. The icon should not have any baked-in shadows or glows. Both the Flathub website and native stores apply a shadow to all icons, so baked-in shadows result in double shadows or other glitches. I have seen a lot of icons, and it is very, very common for an icon to have baked-in shadows or baked-in glows. This is a bug in Flathub and the stores. I don't think either of these are in a position to tell the general design industry that you cannot use this simple design concept. Just find a better way to highlight an icon. Baked-in shadows are not going away, and this is a battle you are never going to win. Now, the next one is where it gets really controversial. In line with contemporary styles. The icon should be somewhat in line with contemporary icon styles, i.e., not look like it hasn't been updated in decades. The GNOME and KDApp icon guidelines are example of the kind of style your icon should align with. This is basically just saying you have to make a minimal icon. I don't think there's anything wrong with this one. I don't think there's anything wrong with this one. They are perfectly acceptable icons. Unless you want to go full-on Android or full-on iOS with it, where you set specific guidelines on what an icon is allowed to look like, I don't think Flathub is the place to try and set an icon theme. I think there is a case, obviously, for where you're not using the icon sizing correctly, or you've got this really, really bad contrast, but for things like this is still a good icon. This is still a good icon, and especially in the case of games, for example, games are never going to be updated with these weird minimal icons that everybody is currently obsessed with, because in a couple of years, this is not going to be the obsession, and we have a whole new design principle that everything just suddenly has to align with. Let's move on to app name. Not too long. The name should ideally be no longer than 15 characters and must be shorter than 20 characters. Well, it's too bad that a lot of people complained about this name, otherwise it might have hit that goal, and there are a lot of applications that have names that are longer than 20 characters. I feel like that's a really, really strict guideline. Maybe 25 or 30 is a better place to set it at. This is a key example of why 20 doesn't work. This is a totally acceptable name. Apostrophe markdown is not too long. This needs to be adjusted, otherwise basically nothing is going to meet it. I will agree though that this one doesn't really work. It's a very generic name and you don't really need the description in the title, but I can't agree with this. just the name, without any additional info. For example, don't append what the app does to the name, and use the summary to provide the extra information instead. For example, don't have apostrophe dash markdown editor, I agree. Don't have apostrophe in brackets markdown editor, don't have apostrophe special edition. Now, I will completely disagree with this. Let's say, for example, you have Discord and Discord Canary both available. Calling them both Discord does a complete disservice to the user, and that is not a good way to do it. Or what about Firefox and Firefox ESR? You cannot call them both Firefox. That does not work. No weird formatting or punctuation. For example, it should not be all lowercase, all uppercase, camel case, or contain dashes or periods. Cases where the weird formatting is part of the brand are exempt, e.g. VLC. Well, this means that literally every single name is exempt from this, because the name is the brand. The only case where it is not exempt is when someone is doing a third-party package and then just names it weirdly. But if you have something like RPCS3, this is going to be in all caps. If you have something like GIMP, obviously they renamed it to GNU image manipulation, blah, 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 blah. That's going to have the GNU part capitalized. Or if it was just GIMP, it would all be capitalized. This is the name, this is the brand, this rule doesn't make any sense. Also, they're saying camel case here, but they don't actually mean camel case, they mean Pascal case. And this is not weird formatting. This is a totally normal way to name an application. This is the Flathub homepage right now. We have OpenTrace, we have Focuswriter, we have Local Send, we have RuneLite. Scroll down a bit more, we have RetroArch. This is a LibreOffice. LibreOffice is a great example. This is a totally normal way to name an application. Just delete that rule. It's a bad rule. Also, all lowercase isn't that weird anyway. We have things like Zemu, and I'm sure I can find a bunch of others if I search long enough. Moving on from that, summary. Not too long. The summary should ideally be between 10 and 25 characters and no longer than 35. So, write Markdown in style, but simple and easy to use, distraction-free Markdown editor written in Python. Now, this is not bad to have on the page, but this is part of the description, not the summary. They're two separate things. That's fine. Also, the summary should be understandable by a non-technical person, and should not contain any technical terms. Do not mention the toolkit, programming language, or other implementation details that would not be relevant to a non-developer, and explain what the app does for people instead. Don't duplicate metadata that's already available in a different form, such as the license, by mentioning the app is free and open source. Avoid nouns like app, tool, or client. I will agree with this in most contexts. However, there are cases where the application is explicitly technical. It's something like Wireshark. It's a GTK4 demo application. It's Vulkan Capture for OBS. And if you don't include that in the summary, then once again, you're just doing a disservice to the user. But if you're something like a text editor, it doesn't matter there's a GTK4 text editor, that is completely irrelevant. No weird formatting or punctuation. It should use sentence case rather than title case, and it shouldn't end in a full stop. So this is a bad example, and I think it might be a bad guideline. Let's take a look. So these lines right here are the summaries. So we have capitals, 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 and weird punctuation. No, that's not capitals. We have capitals. And capitals. And capitals. And capitals. And capitals and weird punctuation. Capitals. No, that's actually proper nouns. And capitals. Do I think this is a problem? Not particularly. Most systems that have summaries are totally okay with having capitalization like this in a summary. I think it's fine. But I will agree, don't repeat the name again. The summary is literally right below the name, you don't need to say it again. Moving on to descriptions, I feel like this is fairly reasonable. Don't repeat the summary. Don't make it too short. So this part down here, this is your description. No super long list, so don't just have a bunch of dot points and nothing else. Also, totally fair, there is a better way to frame it. Put it in a paragraph. Dot points are fine, but it shouldn't be the only thing. Now, screenshots are a big one, and I feel like a lot of app listings are really bad at this. Make sure you include a screenshot. For most applications, 3 to 6 is probably fine. For a large application, 6 to 10, any more than 10 is probably too many. Completely agree. This is the same way on things like Steam as well. When I see a game that has like 20 trailers or 20 screenshots listed, I'm like, why? What are you trying to show? And then half of them are the exact same thing, but slightly different. Like, what are you doing? Tag screenshots with the correct language. So if language is relevant, like if there's text in the image, make sure you say what language it's in. Easy enough. Just the application window. So don't include your entire desktop unless the desktop is relevant. There are cases where the desktop could be relevant, and that should also be added. Don't include marketing pictures, whether be on the sunny side in a picture of a weather app. Just include the window. Take the screenshots on Linux and use the default settings. Don't have some weird custom theme installed unless that custom theme ships with the application. If there is an officially supported dark mode or officially supported different themes, that's fine, but that's the only case where it's fine. Now, how they've worded the next one is really weird. Include window shadow and rounded corners. That makes sense, but screenshots must include the native toolkit shadow and rounding. What if the toolkit doesn't do shadow and rounding? Also, rounding is done by the compositor. So if my compositor doesn't do that and I don't have window shadows, that is my native thing. App stores do not add a shadow after the fact, and without one, screenshots can look glitchy or have low contrast depending on the background. Right, but this has nothing to do with the native toolkit shadow and rounding. This has to do with you not including a shadow. We can translate this to say, take the screenshot on GNOME or KDE, which is fine as a guideline, but don't say it in this weird roundabout way. Next is reasonable window size. Make sure the screenshot is actually legible. If you have a 4K display, for example, make sure you account for that in the screenshot. Either zoom in or make the image bigger. Just do something to make it, viewable on normal displays. Image captions. Every screenshot should have a caption briefly describing it. Nothing to complain about here. Now, good content. I agree that good content is important. Don't just include nonsense screenshots for the sake of nonsense screenshots. This is a really bad example, though. Please, for the love of God, if you don't want to get bullied on the internet, you don't want to get death threats, if you make a contacts app, don't use Karl Marx as your example. I'm just telling you this now because you are going to get bullied for this. The best thing about this is the actual version of GNOME Contacts, which is what this is, doesn't use this picture. They could have just used the actual example, which is a good example. I don't know why they felt the need to make a bad example like this. Preferably either use yourself, a completely non-controversial figure, or just AI generator person. Make a fake face and just use that. Also, make sure they're up to date. If you do some big UI changes, update the screenshots to make sure that it actually aligns with that. Make good release notes. Make sure you actually make release notes for every release. Make sure they're short but informative. And don't just include generic things like bug fixes and performance improvements, like I would commonly do with my Git logs. Actually write something for the users who are going to ask what actually changed. And lastly, age ratings. This is not going to be relevant for a lot of applications, but if you have some preloaded content, it's a manga reader that connects to a server, which is the example they gave here. Obviously rate it based on the pre-configured servers. But if it's a web browser, it's a text editor, obviously there is no way to apply an age rating to that. Or for an image viewer or a video player, just because someone can load porn into that doesn't mean that that should have an adult rating. That is not something being shipped with the application. Whilst I am very, very critical of a lot of the points on this list. I think overall, they are generally good guidelines, but there are some in here which either should be deleted or be completely reworked. But let me know your thoughts down below. Do you think they're good guidelines? Do you think Flathub even needs guidelines? And do you think it's in a place to actually set guidelines in the first place? I would love to know. So if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Brodie, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and check me out on the other hub.